Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They didn't even bother lying this time. No last minute, the invite must have gotten lost. No hastily thrown in, you're always welcome. Not even the usual group text with the date and time. There was a silence so deliberate it might as well have been an RSVP with my name already crossed out. My brother Tyler had a little celebration on Saturday night. Those were his words when I called him the day before, just to casually ask what everyone was up to over the weekend. Pretending like I didn't already see the group photo Mom had accidentally posted to Facebook 2 days too early. She took it down, of course, but the damage was done. Everyone was there. Even Aunt Lydia, who hasn't left her house since she broke her hip. Even my cousin Brent and his wife, who only show up when someone dies or graduates. Everyone was there, except me. When I asked Tyler about it, he didn't flinch. Didn't stumble. Just said, "It's just a celebration of success. Work thing." Then he laughed and added, "You know how it is, nothing big." And just like that, I was dismissed, neatly and efficiently, like an unread newsletter tossed into a trash folder. So I didn't argue. I didn't push. I didn't beg for a seat at a table where the only thing warm was the casserole. I hung up, ordered a large pepperoni pizza, added extra cheese and crispy crust like I used to when I was married, kicked off my shoes, and slid into my spot on the couch in sweatpants that were about 2 sizes past respectable. I put on the news, just for the noise, thinking I'd drown out the echo of their voices in my head. Imagine laughter, imagine toasts, imagine looks passed between people who never imagined me at all. And that's when it happened. They cut to a breaking news story. That tone of voice newscasters use when it's serious, but they're trying not to sound too thrilled. I was only half listening until I heard my company's name, Burlingame Analytics. A name no one in my family could ever remember, let alone pronounce. And then I heard my name. Clear as a bell. Melissa Jameson, senior data analyst, whose internal research helped expose what's now being called the largest coordinated real estate fraud ring in the tri-state area. I sat straight up. My pizza went cold in the box on the coffee table. My face, my ID badge photo, no less, was suddenly plastered across the screen, right under the banner, "Whistleblower breaks silence." Except I hadn't broken anything. Not publicly. I hadn't spoken to anyone outside our firm. My data had been submitted quietly, through the right internal channels, reviewed, corroborated, and then handed over to the feds 6 weeks ago. I wasn't supposed to be part of this story. I was just the math girl. The pattern finder. The one in the back office who knew how to build models that caught liars before they got loud. I watched as the anchors explained how the fraud worked, how dozens of companies had laundered dirty money through shell real estate holdings, how they manipulated appraisals, faked inspections, and pushed inflated property values to create bubbles they could burst for profit. And one of the names on that list of implicated firms? A boutique real estate group based in Glenmont, run by none other than, wait for it, my baby brother, Tyler Jameson. I stared at the screen in a fog, feeling a chill run down my back, the kind you get when you realize the horror movie you're watching just broke the fourth wall. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I hadn't flagged Tyler's firm specifically. I had reviewed transaction data from several cities, identified anomalies, and passed them up the chain. But as the report continued, it became clear Tyler's name wasn't peripheral. He was named as a key figure of interest tied to at least 5 property flips with falsified valuations. They showed documents, some of which I remembered running through filters on my end. Hell, I may have been the one who color-coded the discrepancies and sent them along. I never thought to check the names. That's when the absurdity of it all hit me. While my family sat around a candlelit table eating roast and raising glasses to Tyler's big win, the very foundation of that success was collapsing beneath him, brick by fraudulent brick. And I was the one holding the sledgehammer without even knowing it. So here's where I pause and ask you something. If you were me, sitting there with half a slice of pizza in one hand and your face on national television in the other, what would you do next? Would you call your mom and ask why she thought it was okay to exclude you from yet another dinner? Would you confront your brother and ask how long he'd been smiling that slick salesman grin while laundering cash like a mobster? Or would you sit back, take another bite of pepperoni, and let it all burn? I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I just sat there and watched the broadcast like it was a movie, and I was the twist ending no one saw coming. Then I went to bed, early, and dreamt of nothing. Because I knew something was coming. You can't toss a grenade like that into a dinner party and not expect the phone to start ringing. And ring it did. The morning came not with the gentle unfolding of light through blinds or the faint rustle of branches outside my bedroom window, but with an unrelenting vibration that pulsed through the nightstand like an alarm clock on steroids. And when I finally peeled my eyes open and reached for my phone, expecting maybe an email from work or a push notification from that weather app that's always wrong, I was instead greeted with a screen so crowded with alerts that for a brief moment, I honestly thought the phone had broken or glitched itself into a loop. But no, it was very real, and it was personal. There were 87 missed calls. I counted them twice because the number felt almost comical at first, the way a child might stack toy blocks too high until they all come tumbling down. There were voicemails from people I hadn't spoken to in years, text messages layered so thickly that the notification center had collapsed them into a single ominous bubble, many more messages. As if the phone itself had decided I couldn't emotionally handle the deluge. The first voicemail I opened was from my mother. Her voice was tight, teetering on that passive-aggressive line she always danced so gracefully, a tone that said, "I'm worried," but meant, "I'm furious." She didn't mention the news report directly, but her words left no doubt. "Melissa, it's your mother. I think you should come by, maybe explain some things. I just don't understand what you were thinking. Call me back. No, love you. No, are you okay?" Just confusion disguised as concern, as if I'd dropped a bomb on the family out of spite and was now expected to come sweep up the ashes wearing a polite smile and a clean shirt. The next voicemail was from Tyler. His voice, normally smooth and self-assured like the closing pitch of a man used to people saying yes, now cracked in places that hinted at panic and, beneath that, rage. "What the hell did you do?" he asked, without preamble. No greeting, no pleasantries. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I've got lawyers calling me at 6 in the goddamn morning. You couldn't have just talked to me first." The message ended abruptly, as if he'd hung up mid-thought or thrown the phone across the room. I imagined him pacing around his kitchen in that overpriced bathrobe he got from a hotel in Miami, the one he always bragged about but never washed. By the time I sat up in bed, my heart was pounding not from guilt, because guilt is something you feel when you've done something wrong, and I hadn't, but from the sheer tidal wave of response, from the realization that something I had set in motion, something clinical and logical and buried in spreadsheets and geolocation flags and metadata, had now spilled out into the open and flooded the lives of people who, until last night, didn't even know what I did for a living. And now they were calling me a whistleblower, a traitor, maybe even a destroyer of the very name I had carried silently for over 4 decades while sitting at Thanksgiving tables where I carved turkey, but never expectations. At work, things were different, quieter, almost reverent. When I walked in through the glass doors of Burlingame Analytics, no one made eye contact the way they usually did when trying to avoid getting sucked into a meeting. Instead, they looked at me the way people look at someone who's just come back from battle, unsure whether to offer congratulations or condolences. My manager didn't say anything, just nodded, and then my email pinged. A calendar invite, subject line all caps, meet, urgent, Carter/Melissa. Carter Rivers had only been at the company for a few months, brought in to clean house and modernize infrastructure, which was code for firing people politely and installing software no one understood. He was tall, quiet, wore gray everything, gray suits, gray ties, gray expressions. But that day, when I stepped into his office, I saw something different in his eyes. Not panic. Not concern. Something closer to respect. He didn't waste time. "You're aware of what hit the press last night?" I nodded. "I didn't release your name," he said, almost defensively. "The feds did. Someone on the inside leaked your credentials with the report. We're already filing a complaint, but the cat's out." I asked if we were being sued. He said not yet, but it was coming. Then he leaned forward and dropped a line I didn't expect. "I want you in on the briefings. Not as an analyst. As an asset." He explained that my pattern work, those late nights I spent connecting dots no one else cared about, those cross-referenced addresses and asset movements I built from scratch, was being considered not just valuable, but central to the ongoing federal investigation. The agents were impressed. One of them even called it the cleanest internal detection file they'd ever seen. I had done something real. Something that mattered. And somehow, I had done it without even knowing that my brother's name would end up in the middle of it. And that's what made it all so much worse. Because now I had to make a decision. Not a dramatic, movie-style decision with explosions and background music, but a quiet, cold, real-world decision that would echo through the people who shared my DNA. Do I step back, let someone else finish the job, protect what little remains of the family name? Or do I lean in, take the briefings, help the investigators, and finish what I accidentally started, even if that means burning the last bridge I have to people who already left me stranded? As I left Carter's office, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from a number I didn't recognize. You think you're safe just because you're the smart one? Watch your back. I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it. No response. Not today. Because I wasn't the same woman they left off the guest list. I wasn't the one who needed permission to speak anymore. And I wasn't afraid of who I had become. There's a particular kind of silence that fills a room after a name like yours has been dragged into daylight, especially when that name was never meant to be said out loud by anyone outside your payroll department or a dentist's receptionist. It's not the kind of silence that feels peaceful or reflective, but rather one that settles into the corners of your office like smoke after a fire, thick, heavy, and undeniably tied to something that can't be undone. And in the days that followed the news broadcast, I began to realize just how much the world shifts when your invisibility is suddenly revoked not by choice or charm, but by a spotlight you never asked for and consequences you never predicted. People began treating me differently at work, not in a celebratory way as if I'd won something or achieved a milestone worth balloons, but more like they were trying to figure out if I had always been this capable, or if I had simply gotten lucky and stumbled into a storm wearing a lightning rod. There were whispers in the break room, quiet hallway detours when I walked toward someone, and a level of vague deference in emails that felt like everyone had been told to keep me on their good side just in case I knew something else they didn't want to come out. It wasn't flattery. Not even respect, it was fear wrapped in politeness, and while part of me wanted to revel in that shift, to finally taste what it felt like not to be overlooked, the larger part of me felt nauseated by it, because now I knew what it cost. The strange thing is, I hadn't intended to expose anyone specific. Months before any of this came to light, I had stumbled onto a series of inconsistencies while compiling market trend reports for a property development client, and what initially caught my attention wasn't anything obviously criminal or explosive. It was just the math. Something didn't add up. The purchase and resale prices were moving in loops that made no economic sense unless someone, somewhere, was manipulating the data behind the scenes. So I dug deeper. Not because I was on some moral crusade, but because I've always been the kind of person who needs to understand the structure beneath the numbers. It's my coping mechanism, the way some people drink or jog or scream into pillows. I map data. It was around that time Carter Rivers was brought in, a quiet, corporate wolf dressed in neutrality, tasked with redefining operational integrity. Which is just HR speak for cutting out deadweight and installing a surveillance culture masked as analytics. Most people avoided him, not because he was unkind, but because there was something too still about him, like a man who watched the room for leverage rather than companionship. But he noticed me. Not in a flirtatious way or even friendly, it was clinical, precise, like he was placing a chess piece that no one else realized was in play. One afternoon, he called me into his office with barely a sentence of warning and asked to see the query logs I'd been using for the Glenmont data cluster. I remember feeling a jolt of fear, the irrational kind that comes when you think you've broken something even though you know you followed every rule. But he didn't scold or accuse. He just said, "You've found something I've been trying to prove for over a year." And from that moment on, I wasn't just an analyst anymore, I was a collaborator. We worked quietly, in tandem, under layers of encrypted correspondence and proxy usernames. What I thought were anomalies became patterns. What looked like careless accounting turned out to be the architecture of a fraud machine disguised as urban development. Dozens of shell companies, inflated appraisals, falsified inspections. It was as if someone had gamified the entire real estate system and figured out how to win at every level without ever touching the board. And among those names, buried not at the top but not far from it, was my brother's firm. I stared at that listing the night Carter showed it to me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like finding your own handwriting on a ransom note or seeing your childhood house in the background of a crime scene photo. I hadn't connected the dots before because I never looked for them, I never thought to. Tyler had always been many things to me: distant, smug, often condescending, but never criminal. Yet there it was, his name, his LLC, tied to transactions flagged for investigation. He wasn't the architect of the scheme, but he wasn't innocent either. He'd bought in. Maybe knowingly, maybe not, but he was in the room. When I finally opened the family group chat again, after days of silence and rage and that empty, echoing absence that comes when everyone pretends they're the ones betrayed, I saw a message from my cousin Brent, probably sent after a few drinks and a lot of frustration. It read, "Guess the quiet one finally made herself useful. Hope the check was worth it." That one hit harder than it should have, not because I expected anything better from Brent, but because the message reflected something that had always existed under the surface in our family, the idea that silence equals insignificance. They never saw me because I didn't demand to be seen. I didn't make noise. I didn't flash success. I just worked. And when the work turned out to matter, they didn't know how to handle it except to resent it. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I let the message sit there like an oil stain on a white shirt, visible, unpleasant, but unworthy of response. That night, Carter called me into another meeting. This time, he didn't mince words. "You're not just a whistleblower, Melissa," he said, folding his hands like a man about to reveal the ending of a story you thought you were writing. "You're our leverage. They're scared of you now, and you need to decide if you want to sit back or lean into that power." I didn't answer him right away, but the truth had already begun to calcify inside me. I didn't want revenge, not in the cartoonish, blow everything up way. What I wanted was acknowledgement, not applause, not medals, just the unspoken recognition that I had been there all along, seeing things clearly while they all mistook silence for absence. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see what happened when the invisible girl stopped apologizing for being right. There is something particularly cruel, almost elegant in its cruelty, about the way people pretend that your silence equals your consent, how they convince themselves that your absence from their table means you were too busy, too distant, or simply not interested, rather than admitting that you were never invited to begin with. And in the days that followed the collapse of Tyler's glass tower of success, after the headlines cooled slightly, but the investigations only deepened, I found myself in a strange, liminal space. Not celebrated, not openly condemned, but rather held in a kind of cautious limbo where no one dared speak to me directly, yet no one could ignore me anymore either. It was as if my mere existence had become a variable in an equation they could no longer solve with charm, tradition, or carefully constructed denial. The calls from my brother had stopped after the third day, probably at the recommendation of his new lawyer. A man named Ross Whitman, whose name sounded like it belonged on the spine of a thriller novel, but whose demeanor suggested he was far more interested in silencing problems than solving them. My mother, however, had not given up so easily. She left messages every evening, all variations of the same two themes, concern laced with condescension and disappointment veiled as moral outrage. "Melissa, we've always supported you," she'd say, as if support meant occasional birthday cards and sideways compliments at Christmas. "I just don't understand why you didn't come to us with this first," she'd add, completely unaware of the irony in asking why the black sheep didn't run home when the wolves showed up. Eventually, I agreed to visit her. Not because I felt the need to explain myself, but because I needed to see, with my own eyes, how deep the denial had burrowed. When I pulled into her driveway, Tyler's BMW conspicuously absent, I noticed the wreath on the door had been turned slightly, the ribbons limp, the color faded from the plastic holly as if even the decorations had grown tired of pretending. She greeted me with a hug too long and too tight, the kind of hug people give when they're trying to squeeze a confession out of your bones. We sat in the living room, where nothing had changed since the Clinton administration except for the size of the television. She offered me tea I didn't want and didn't drink, then launched directly into it, her voice thin and careful, like a woman rehearsing for a role she doesn't fully understand. "You blindsided us, Melissa," she said, not looking me in the eye. "Do you understand what you've done to your brother's reputation?" I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger but with the kind of exhaustion that feels older than your body, and then I asked the question I had never dared to ask before. "Did it ever once occur to you to ask what he did to mine?" She blinked, taken aback, as if I'd spoken in a language she hadn't heard since childhood. I pressed on, my voice steady. "All these years, every promotion I earned, every project I led, every time I brought something to the table, I was treated like background noise. Tyler brings a bottle of wine and a fake story about a condo sale, and you light a candle for him." She looked like she wanted to interrupt, but I didn't let her. "You asked why I didn't come to you first. What would you have done? Told me to let it go? To protect him? Because that's what this is about, isn't it? Protecting him. Not truth. Not justice. Just image." She didn't reply, not really. She stared into her tea like it held the answers I'd never been worthy of. By the following week, the federal task force had expanded its scope, and I was summoned again, not just for consultation but to assist in the construction of a formal prosecutorial timeline. Carter had recommended me directly, and while I wasn't officially employed by the Justice Department, I had been given a short-term advisory badge and access to files that made even me nauseous. The scale of the fraud was far worse than we'd initially uncovered. What we thought had been limited to a handful of bad actors in the tri-state area had grown into a national network of property manipulation schemes, some dating back nearly a decade. And Tyler, smiling, posturing, ever-invincible Tyler, had been an early adopter, someone who helped normalize the process before it became industrialized. They found emails, receipts, even recorded calls. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was airtight. And yet, in the twisted logic of public perception, I knew that none of this would be enough to erase the label some had already applied to me: traitor. Not to the law, but to the family. Because when people say blood is thicker than water, they rarely finish the original phrase, which ends, "But the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." In other words, the bonds you choose can be stronger than the ones you're born into. I hadn't chosen them, not for years. But I had chosen integrity. And integrity, like most things worth holding on to, doesn't come cheap. Despite everything, I was offered something I hadn't expected: a promotion. Carter brought me into his office late one afternoon, his tie loosened, his voice low. "They want to move you up," he said. "Full oversight of the fraud prevention unit. You'll have a team. Budget. Autonomy." I stared at him for a moment, then asked, "Why me?" He smiled faintly. "Because you actually give a damn. And because you weren't afraid to blow it all up when it needed burning." I accepted the offer, of course. Not out of vengeance, but out of resolve. I wasn't invisible anymore, and I didn't intend to fade back into the wallpaper of my own life just because things had gotten messy. 2 days later, I received an invitation to a community recognition dinner hosted by the local bar association. They were giving an award for integrity and civic contribution, and apparently someone had put my name forward. I laughed when I saw the guest list: judges, prosecutors, a few elected officials, and, tucked between names like Honorable Richard Morley and Dr. Layla Carrington, was Melissa Jameson, Data Integrity Consultant. Funny, I thought. For someone who wasn't invited to dinner just a week ago, I suddenly couldn't walk 3 blocks without someone trying to seat me at the head of a table. And yet, when I looked at the RSVP list one more time, just out of morbid curiosity, I noticed one thing that stopped me cold. There was another name on it: Carter Rivers. But under +1, someone had typed, "Pending confirmation from EJ." And I knew in that moment that the next chapter was coming. Because there was only one person I'd ever known who went by those initials. And he wasn't part of the story yet. The thing about truth, real truth, not the kind people fabricate to win arguments or justify betrayal, but the raw, irreparable kind that unspools in silence, is that it rarely arrives all at once like some cinematic revelation. More often, it creeps in at the edges, in sideways glances, in names dropped too casually, in the quiet realization that someone you trusted once laid a trap so delicate, so surgically designed, that even now, knowing what I know, I can't quite pinpoint the moment it snapped shut around me. And yet, as I sat there in my new office, a space with a door that locked, a window that overlooked something other than a brick wall, and a nameplate bearing the title Lead Investigative Consultant, I couldn't stop my mind from spiraling back to that RSVP line, that half-typed note that said EJ pending, like a ghost I thought I had buried was tapping lightly on the glass again, asking if I remembered him. EJ was Elliot Jameson, my ex-husband. A name that, for a long time, I couldn't say out loud without tasting rust and regret. We had met in our late 20s, two people who believed, perhaps foolishly, that shared ambition could carry a relationship further than love or compatibility. He was charming in the way that men who live slightly above the rules often are, never sloppy, never overtly cruel, but always walking that razor-thin line between brilliance and manipulation. At first, I mistook his attention for understanding, his hunger for success as a shared drive rather than a competition I never agreed to enter. And by the time I realized I wasn't building a life with him so much as scaffolding for him to climb, it was too late. The divorce was just paperwork, but the betrayal lingered like mold under fresh paint. So seeing his initials again, at a legal event no less, attached to the name of Carter Rivers, the one person I believed had no prior connection to any of the people who had once fractured my life, felt less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a thread being tugged. And once you notice a thread like that, once you feel it shift beneath your fingers, you can't help but pull. I started small, asking around with the careful, casual tone of someone who doesn't want to raise alarms but needs answers. Most people didn't know much. Carter was a closed book, tightly bound, rarely discussing his past or his relationships, but one junior associate mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Carter had once worked at a firm in D.C. that specialized in internal fraud investigations for high-net-worth clients, a place Elliot had consulted for during the year following our divorce. It was enough of a connection to push me further, to dig back through old emails, metadata, even encrypted folders I hadn't touched in years. I told myself it was just curiosity, professional diligence. But deep down, I knew I was chasing a suspicion I didn't want to believe could be true. And then I found it. Not a smoking gun, those are rare and usually theatrical, but something quieter, more insidious, a forwarded message from nearly 2 years ago, buried in an archive chain between Elliot and an anonymous tip submission site linked to federal property compliance. The language was vague but pointed, referencing the very property network that Tyler would eventually be tied to. And the metadata, it traced the origin of the submission back to a shared drive Elliot and I had used when we were married. A drive I never shut down. A drive he still had access to, because I had forgotten to revoke it. He had used my folder, my logins, my spreadsheets, my meticulous documentation, and fed them, anonymously, to the government. He had known what I was working on before I even understood its full scope, and he had waited, quietly, until the time was right to release it. I felt the room tilt slightly. The air became too thick, my lungs too shallow. The realization came not as a scream, but as a sigh, the kind you let out when you know the answer and wish you didn't. Elliot hadn't just used me. He had engineered the entire situation so that when the pieces fell, they would form a portrait that looked like I was the one holding the brush. I sent one email. Just one. To Carter. Subject line, let's be honest. The body contained a single sentence. You already knew Elliot was involved, didn't you? His reply came 20 minutes later. No denials. No explanations. Just, come to the top floor at 7. And bring everything you've got. That evening, I walked into a meeting that didn't feel like a meeting. It felt like a reckoning. Carter stood by the window, backlit by the city lights, holding a folder that bore the seal of a government agency I didn't recognize. He looked tired, not like someone caught in a lie, but like someone who had run out of reasons to hide the truth. He approached me a year ago, Carter said. He said you had the data, that you wouldn't go public unless forced. He said he wanted to protect you from yourself. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was the most absurd thing I'd heard since Tyler's celebration of success. Elliot had always painted his control as concern, his manipulation as love. And now, even in his absence, he was trying to write the narrative. I slid the USB drive across the table. Everything's on there, I said. The full trail. My original files, the access logs, his fingerprints all over it. You want to clean this up? Start with him. Carter nodded slowly, picked up the drive, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked at me not as a tool or a resource, but as someone he had underestimated. He's going to come after you, he said. I shrugged. He already did. I just didn't know it until now. That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done since the first evening all this began. I ordered pizza. Same order, pepperoni, extra cheese, crispy crust. It arrived in under 30 minutes, handed to me by a college kid who smiled like he had no idea he was delivering dinner to a woman who had dismantled 3 empires with nothing but data and patience. I sat on the couch, opened the box, and found a slip of paper tucked beneath the lid, written in thick black marker. They'll never see you coming. No signature. No name. Just a reminder that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what I was capable of. And maybe, finally, so did I. Because I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I wasn't the wife who left quietly, the analyst who said nothing, the sister they never saved a seat for. I was the storm they didn't see until it was already inside the walls. And as I took a bite, hot cheese burning the roof of my mouth, I smiled, not because it was over, but because I knew it wasn't. Not yet. Some battles aren't won with declarations or applause. Some are won in silence, one name at a time, crossed off a list no one else knows exists. And mine had only just begun.